A wounded German shepherd lay half buried in the snow beside a frozen river, breath fading, body shaking, as the storm swallowed the last traces of hope. No one was supposed to reach him. No one was supposed to hear that final cry. But a Navy SEAL passing through the mountains, a man carrying scars the world never sees, caught a flicker of movement in the blinding white. And when he lifted that broken dog into his arms, the forest began to shift, because something ancient was watching from the tree line. What happened next will reveal that even in the wildest winter, loyalty can rise where fear once lived. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country below. Winter wrapped itself around Frostpine Range, the way an old quilt settles over a sleeping child. Heavy, slow, and impossibly quiet. Dawn hadn't quite broken. Instead, a bluish haze hovered above the snow-covered slopes of northern Wyoming, softening the world into pale shadows and muted shapes. Wind drifted lazily between the pines, carrying with it the sharp scent of ice and evergreen bark. The Pine Heart River, half frozen but still alive beneath its armor of frost, murmured faintly as it threaded its way through the valley. Jacob Hartman walked beside that river with the practiced caution of a man who had learned long ago to absorb every detail of his surroundings. At 38, Jacob carried a solid, angular build, broad shoulders, long stride, thick forearms, shaped by 15 years of Navy SEAL service. But his movements now were quieter than military precision alone could explain. There was something contemplative about him, something inward, as though he walked not just to survey the land, but to escape the relentless noise inside his own mind. His hair, dark brown with streaks of early gray along the temples, stuck out slightly from beneath his knit cap. A short, neatly trimmed beard softened the sharp lines of his jaw. His eyes, steel blue and deeply set, held the distant focus of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and come to Frostpine Range chasing the kind of silence that might let him breathe again. 2 years earlier, a mission gone wrong had taken both his best friend and a piece of himself. Since then, he had carried guilt like a second skin. The mountains were supposed to give him peace, but peace was a slow learner. As he walked the narrow path along the riverbank, Jacob let the cold air sting his cheeks, grounding him in the present moment. His boots crunched rhythmically through powdery snow. Above him, ravens cut across the sky in dark, quiet arcs. Everything felt still. Then he heard it, a small, fragile sound, so faint it nearly disappeared beneath the whispering wind. Jacob stopped instantly. He tilted his head, listening again. There, barely audible, trembling, came a whimper. His pulse sharpened. It wasn't a fox, not a coyote, not a bird. The sound carried a raw desperation he recognized deep in his bones. He followed it, stepping off the trail, moving quickly but carefully toward the river's bend. The whimper came again, sharper this time. Jacob's breath caught. A young German shepherd, no more than 6 months old, was trapped in the icy river, its front paws scrambling against a jagged chunk of ice as the current dragged the rest of its body downward. The dog's fur, soaked and darkened, clung to a shivering frame far too small to survive this kind of cold. Its eyes were wide and panicked, pleading even though it was too exhausted to make more than weak, broken sounds. Jacob's chest tightened painfully at the sight. The pup tried to lift itself again but slipped, half submerged, head dipping beneath the freezing water, before fighting back up with the last scraps of strength. He didn't think. He reacted, "Hang on, buddy," Jacob murmured, though the pup could barely keep its head above water, let alone hear him. He scanned the riverbank for a safer path. There wasn't one. The river narrowed here, forcing the current to surge violently around the trapped animal. His thoughts raced, but his decision came instantly, cleanly, like muscle memory from years of rescuing people under impossible conditions. He shrugged off his pack, dropped to one knee, and crawled closer to the river's edge. The ice crackled ominously beneath him. A familiar voice from his past whispered warnings. Cold shock, sudden incapacitation, risk of being swept downstream. But Jacob shut it out. The pup let out a soft cry, barely a sound at all. That was enough. Far below, in the quiet town of Pine Grove, Agnes Porter, 71 years old, wiped frost from the window of her small rescue center. Agnes was a petite woman with soft gray curls pinned loosely behind her head, warm brown eyes that always carried a spark of empathy, and a face lined with gentle wrinkles earned from decades of caring for abandoned animals. Her hands, though thin, were steady, hands that had bottle-fed kittens, stitched up injured foxes, and soothed trembling dogs left at her doorstep. She paused when a strange flutter ran through her chest, a prickle of intuition she'd learned not to ignore. Winter storms always brought trouble, and she feared that somewhere out there, an animal was fighting for its life. She whispered a small prayer to the mountains, hoping she was wrong. Back at the river, Jacob tested the ice with his weight. It groaned, but held. The German shepherd struggled again, then went still, floating helplessly against the current. "Damn it," Jacob breathed. There was no more time. He rose to his feet, muscles coiled, every instinct in him tightening like a drawn bowstring. He could feel the river's cold radiating upward, biting at his legs even before he stepped in. The dog's head slipped beneath the surface. "No!" Jacob lunged forward. The world became an explosion of cold. The river swallowed him instantly, ice water crushing the air from his lungs. He gasped reflexively, pain shooting through his chest like a blade. His body seized, but he forced it forward, kicking hard, pushing through the current with sheer willpower. He reached the pup just as its body drifted sideways into deeper water. Jacob grabbed the scruff of its neck with one hand and pulled it to his chest. The dog didn't fight. It was too weak. Its shivers were faint, fading. Jacob held it tightly, teeth chattering, limbs screaming from the cold. "Hold on," he whispered, voice shaking. "I've got you. I'm not letting you go." The river pulled at them like a living thing, current swirling around his legs as if trying to claim them both. He planted his feet, searching for traction, but the ground beneath him was unstable. Slick stones coated in ice. His muscles burned. His vision blurred at the edges. The weight of the dog and the resistance of the river combined into a brutal battle that dragged him toward exhaustion far too quickly. But Jacob summoned strength from some stubborn place inside him, some place that refused to lose another life. Not today. He pushed forward. One step, another. Every movement was agony. And then, his hand found the frozen riverbank. Jacob threw all his remaining strength into one final motion, hauling the German shepherd out of the water and onto the ice. The pup collapsed against his chest, barely conscious. Jacob's breath rasped in his throat. He could barely feel his fingers. His arms trembled violently from exertion and cold. But Shadow, though he did not know the name yet, was alive. And Jacob Hartman, soaked and shaking, knees buckling beneath him, had only one clear thought left. he had saved the dog. The world narrowed into a blur of snow and cold as Jacob collapsed to the riverbank, having plunged into the freezing water to pull the dog out in a state of exhaustion. The cold clung to Jacob Hartman as if trying to seep through skin and bone, claiming what little warmth he had left. His clothes were drenched, heavy with icy river water, and his breath pushed out in visible bursts as he knelt on the bank, cradling the limp young German shepherd against his chest. The pup shivered violently, its small ribs fluttering like the thin wings of a trapped bird. Jacob steadied his breathing and shifted the dog's weight carefully. "Easy. I've got you," he murmured, though he doubted the pup was conscious enough to hear. The dog's ears drooped, soaked. One of them bent slightly at the tip. An injury, or a birth quirk, Jacob couldn't tell yet. Its fur, black and tan, was tangled with ice shards that glittered in the sparse morning light. The pup couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds, a young creature still caught between the softness of puppyhood and the leaner lines of adulthood. Jacob forced himself to stand. The cold gnawed at his legs, making every movement stiff and sluggish. But he gripped the dog firmly and positioned it across his shoulders, the way he had once carried wounded soldiers across hostile terrain. For a split second, he remembered the heavy weight of his teammate, Reyes, thrown over his shoulder in a war-torn village halfway across the world. Snow was replaced by dust, the wind by burning heat, and the silence by distant gunfire. Reyes had been bleeding badly, whispering jokes even as life slipped from him. A man who had used humor as armor ever since losing his family in a car accident years earlier. Jacob blinked, shutting the memory down before it hollowed him out again. He was here now, and this dog needed him. He stepped back toward the river, knowing he would have to cross a shallower bend downstream to get home. The Pineheart River was treacherous, but not uniform. Certain pockets were calmer, and he had scouted them during earlier hikes. The water there would still bite like knives, but he could manage. "Just hold on," he whispered to the pup, and began the slow, determined trek along the bank. Far below in Pine Grove, Agnes Porter took off her wool gloves and rubbed her palms together, standing behind the reception desk of her rescue shelter. She had returned earlier than usual, compelled by a worry she couldn't shake. Agnes had a stout, grandmotherly frame, though years of lifting heavy crates and stubborn dogs had made her surprisingly strong. Her face was soft, her gray curls unruly and free, and her warm brown eyes carried decades of compassion in their depths. A bell rang as two tourists stepped inside, both bundled in thick jackets, their cheeks red from the cold. The younger of the two, a blond man in his 40s, with a kind face and a small scar running from his eyebrow to his hairline, greeted her politely. His companion, a tall woman with auburn hair tucked under a knitted hat, looked shaken. "Ma'am," the woman began, brushing melting snow from her shoulders. "Are wolves common this close to the river?" Agnes felt her breath hitch. "Not usually," she answered. "Why do you ask?" The blond man exchanged a look with his partner. "We were taking photos by the ridge, and we saw at least 5, maybe 6 wolves together, just standing there, watching the river." Agnes's eyes widened. "The Frost Pine Pack?" The woman nodded. A ripple of unease ran through Agnes. The Frost Pine wolves were known to roam high in the mountains, avoiding humans. For them to gather near the river meant something had disturbed their usual patterns, something they were responding to, perhaps even protecting. "Thank you for telling me," Agnes said, her tone gentle but firm. "If someone's hiking alone in that area..." Her voice trailed off, but her heart quickened. Her instincts told her trouble was brewing. Back on the ridge, Jacob reached the narrow crossing point, a place where the water, while still icy, flowed more gently. His legs trembled from exertion, but he braced himself and stepped into the shallows. Even with the pup's weight balanced on his shoulders, he kept his movement steady and deliberate, planting each step before committing to the next. The cold surged up his legs immediately, sharp and merciless. The current wasn't strong enough to sweep him this time, but it pushed at him insistently, as if testing his resolve. He gritted his teeth and pressed forward. Halfway across, something in the air shifted. The hairs on the back of his neck lifted. Jacob stopped. The river babbled beside him. Wind sliced through the valley. Snow flurried lightly from the branches. Yet beneath these sounds, something else pressed in. A presence. Slowly, Jacob lifted his gaze toward the opposite bank. They were there. 6 wolves stood in a single line across the ridge, their silhouettes stark against the snow. Their fur ranged from ash gray to deep charcoal, thick and wild, dusted with flakes of fresh powder. The largest, a massive wolf with a broad chest and piercing amber eyes, stood at the center. His breath pulsed visibly in the cold, slow, and steady. None of them growled. None of them took a step forward. They simply watched. Jacob's heart hammered, but he kept his posture controlled. His SEAL training had taught him long ago how predators sized up fear, how movement could be interpreted as threat or flight. His grip tightened around the pup's hindquarters. The wolf's eyes tracked his every shift. The pup stirred weakly at the sound of their breathing, a faint whine slipping between its teeth. Jacob swallowed. "Not now, buddy. Hang in there." The leader wolf lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring. His amber eyes flicked from Jacob to the pup and back again. There was something in that stare, something calculating, ancient, and not entirely hostile. It felt less like a predator assessing prey and more like a guardian taking inventory. Jacob's thoughts raced. Wolves didn't congregate like this unless drawn by something powerful: loyalty, grief, or danger. Had the pup belonged to them somehow? Had they been circling the river because they sensed its suffering? The idea sounded impossible. Yet nothing in the wolf pack's behavior matched aggression. Instead, it matched expectation. Snow drifted down in small, swirling flakes as the pack remained motionless, forming a silent witness line along the bank. The icy wind pressed against Jacob's soaked clothing, making every heartbeat feel heavier. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he whispered, even though they couldn't understand English. But perhaps they could understand tone, intent, steadiness. Wolves understood more than people believed. The leader wolf blinked slowly, a calm blink, deliberate, almost like acknowledgement. Jacob breathed out, relieved but still tense. He forced his legs to move, each step slow but intentional. The wolves' heads tracked him in eerie unison as he pushed through the last stretch of water. The cold carved deep into him. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, but he refused to lose control. One more step, then one more. He climbed out of the river at last, his body trembling violently now, his breath fluttering like thin paper in the wind. The wolves didn't move. They stood there, silent, alert, watching him, not attacking, not retreating, as if waiting for something he couldn't yet understand. Holding the half-frozen pup tightly against his chest, Jacob took another careful step up the snowy bank, and the wolves continued to watch him from the ridge, as though they were waiting for something to happen. Snow drifted softly outside Jacob Hartman's cabin, painting the world beyond the frosted windows in shades of white and quiet gray. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush that only winter and Frostpine Range could create. Jacob moved quickly but carefully inside the small wooden space, his wet clothes replaced with warm layers, his hands trembling only slightly as he tended to the injured German shepherd laid out on an old wool blanket near the fire. The pup's breathing was shallow, but it was alive. Alive because Jacob had refused to let go. He crouched beside it now, reaching out with cautious fingers to examine the dog's injuries. The fur was still damp, but the warmth from the fire had begun to soften the stiffness in its coat. The pup flinched slightly as Jacob touched its hind leg. A sharp whimper escaped its throat. "Easy. You're safe," Jacob whispered, his voice steady despite the worry etched into his face. He gently lifted the leg to examine it, frowning when he saw the jagged cut running along the limb. It wasn't a bite. He knew wolf bites. He had studied wildlife extensively before moving here, and this wound was too straight, too coldly precise. Metal. A trap. Jacob's stomach tightened with anger, the muscles in his jaw flexing. The fur around the wound showed signs of tearing, as if the dog had fought desperately to escape. The rawness of the injury told him the creature hadn't been trapped long, maybe a day or two, but long enough to weaken it, long enough for it to stumble into the river, almost frozen and starving. He reached for his med kit, his hands steady in the way they always were when dealing with injuries. Old instincts took over, the ones honed in combat zones, where seconds mattered and lives depended on clarity under pressure. He cleaned the wound, applied an antibiotic ointment, and wrapped it with a soft bandage torn from a cloth he'd kept from his Navy days. It bore faded blue stripes and frayed edges, but Jacob always kept it. It once belonged to Reyes, the friend he'd lost. Using it now felt like honoring him in some small way. When he finished, he sat back and wiped his brow. The pup stared at him, with eyes too gentle for a creature that had been through so much. They were an earthy brown, warm even through pain. The dog's gaze felt questioning, searching, almost grateful. "You need a name," Jacob murmured. The cabin fell silent except for the soft crackle of burning wood. The pup tilted its head faintly, ears twitching, as though listening carefully. "Shadow," Jacob finally said. "You stuck to me like one the moment I found you." The pup's tail moved. Just a small, slow motion, but enough to make Jacob smile. Shadow it is. Far down in Pine Grove, Agnes Porter sat at her small kitchen table, sipping the last of her chamomile tea. The warmth soothed her, but her heart remained restless. She had spent the evening feeding the animals at her shelter and calling the sheriff's office, again, about reports of increased predator activity. They dismissed her, as usual, but Agnes knew better. Her instincts had grown sharp after decades of caring for creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. Her old rotary phone, yellowed with age, suddenly rang. Agnes straightened, setting her mug aside. The calls at night were usually about lost pets or injured wildlife. "Pine Grove Rescue Center, this is Agnes," she answered gently. A man's voice came through, breathless and urgent. "Ma'am, I think my dog went missing. About 2 weeks ago. A young shepherd, brown and black. He's small, still growing. He broke off his rope somehow." Agnes felt her heart jump. "Did he have a bent ear? On the right side?" she asked. Yes, that's him," the man replied, relief and frustration mingling in his tone. but nobody's seen him. I fear someone might have taken him. There have been traps, people setting them out by the ridge. Her mouth drew tense. I've warned the sheriff about that. No one listened. What do I do now? The man asked, his voice cracking slightly. He's all I've got. My wife passed last year. That dog was her gift. He's family. Compassion softened Agnes's face. I'll look into it, and I'll call if I hear anything. She hung up with a heavy heart, her intuition whispering again. Something bad was happening in the mountains, something deliberate. She glanced toward the window, watching snow melt slowly on the sill. She thought of Jacob, the quiet man who kept to himself, but always helped when she needed a hand. Maybe he had seen something today. Back at the cabin, Jacob prepared a bowl of warm broth. Simple, light, something Shadow might manage to drink. He placed it gently near the pup's muzzle. Shadow sniffed weakly, then licked the warm liquid. Jacob exhaled in relief. But as he watched Shadow eat, he noticed something else. Faint red marks around its neck, where the rope had rubbed the skin raw. The edges were frayed, suggesting the dog had chewed or torn itself free. Someone tied you up, Jacob muttered, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He felt a surge of protectiveness, one he hadn't felt in years. It reminded him of the way he used to guard his team, always the first to run into danger, always ready to shield someone else. Shadow wasn't just an animal now. Shadow was his responsibility. Night settled fully over the mountains, the sky black except for faint stars peeking through drifting clouds. Jacob sat near the fire, half asleep in a wooden chair, exhaustion pulling at him. The heat from the flames filled the room, contrasting sharply with the icy trail still etched into his bones. Shadow lay curled on the blanket, chest rising and falling in a soft rhythm. Jacob allowed his eyes to close. Hours passed quietly until Shadow jerked awake. A sharp bark shattered the silence, cutting through the cabin like a blade. Jacob snapped upright, adrenaline flooding his system. Shadow stood on trembling legs, his fur bristling along his back, eyes fixed on the window facing the forest. A low growl rumbled from the pup's throat, instinctive, primal. Jacob's hand went to the flashlight near his boots. What is it? But he didn't need an answer, because outside, beyond the glass, several shapes moved through the tree line. Silent, deliberate, in perfect formation. Eyes reflecting pale moonlight. The frost pine wolves, coming closer. Not with snarls, not with menace, but with purpose. Shadow barked again, and Jacob stepped toward the window, breath held tight. The wolves had returned, and they were surrounding the cabin in complete, ghostly silence. The morning arrived muted and pale, the kind of winter morning where light didn't rise so much as it cautiously seeped through low clouds. Frostpine Range looked like a world brushed in powdered silver, every pine needle outlined in delicate ice. Jacob Hartman stepped outside his cabin with a thick jacket pulled tightly around his frame, the cold biting instantly at his cheeks. Shadow limped behind him on his freshly bandaged leg, determined to follow despite his injury. The German Shepherd was young, barely 6 months old, but there was a quiet persistence in his movements that reminded Jacob of rookies he had once trained. Wounded, scared, but impossibly brave. Jacob scanned the area around the cabin. The snow was disturbed in a perfect semicircle, clear impressions of wolf paws, dozens of them, layered over each other like relics in frozen dust. The pack had come close last night, closer than any wild wolves should. and yet they had made no attempt to attack, no effort to break into the cabin. They had watched, just watched. Shadow sniffed the air, his fur bristling slightly. Jacob reached down and rested a hand gently on his head. Easy. They're gone now. But something tugged at his instincts. Wolves didn't behave like that unless something was deeply wrong or deeply meaningful. Jacob followed the tracks leading away from the cabin, Shadow hobbling after him. As he walked, he noticed more than just paw prints. Snow was disturbed by heavier impressions. Boots. 2 different sizes at least, moving in erratic lines as if the people had been searching for something or setting something. The tracks led Jacobs deeper into the forest, through a corridor of towering pines whose branches groaned under the weight of accumulated snow. Eventually, he spotted the first metal glint, a steel trap. Jacob crouched beside it, jaw tightening as he brushed snow from the mechanism. It was freshly set, cruel and efficient, its metal teeth sharp enough to snap bone. The surrounding snow held small flecks of blood, partially frozen. He exhaled slowly, the breath fogging before him. "This is where you got caught," he murmured to Shadow. Shadow whined softly in reply, lowering his head. Jacob felt a spike of anger pierce his chest. Someone was using traps illegally in a protected wildlife zone. Worse, someone was using the area Shadow had been found. The river bend, the ridge, the trail. Someone wanted the wolves. A few feet away, he found a second trap, then a third, and then a piece of rope half buried in snow, frayed at one end. Jacob lifted it, inspecting the fibers. It matched the faint rope burn marks around Shadow's neck. "Someone tied you up," Jacob whispered. "Left you here to lure them in." Shadow pressed against his leg, trembling. Jacob gently rubbed behind his ear, offering reassurance. But inside, Jacob felt something cold and hard forming, a resolve sharper than the winter air. He stood, scanning the tree line again. The wolves' tracks were everywhere, moving around the traps, circling them, even sniffing at them. Many prints seemed frantic, scattered. It told a story Jacob could almost read like a page. The pack had tried to reach Shadow before he entered the river. They had been desperate, but wolves had no hands, no way to unclip a rope or break steel jaws. They had been forced to watch him drown. The thought clenched at Jacob unexpectedly. If Shadow had belonged to them even briefly, if they had protected him, fed him, kept him safe, then their watching Jacob carry the pup away began to make sense. They weren't stalking. They were mourning. Jacob crouched again, this time tracing the boot prints. Whoever set these traps walked with a long stride, heavy heel marks. The boots were large, size 12, maybe 13, likely a man. A second set, smaller, size 8 or 9, walked alongside him, but at a distance. 2 trappers, maybe more, experienced ones, given the way they'd set traps in an overlapping pattern. "Whoever did this is close," Jacob muttered. Shadow barked softly, ears perked. "Yeah, we're going to find them." Far below the mountain, Agnes Porter sat at the wooden desk in her living room. The desk was old cedar, polished by years of letters, donation forms, and the gentle weight of her late husband's hands. Agnes pulled open the bottom drawer and retrieved a worn leather notebook, the last possession of Benjamin Porter, her husband. Benjamin had been a tall, lean man with sun-beaten skin and calm gray eyes. A park ranger for 30 years, he had tracked the Frostpine wolves since their first documented appearance. He believed deeply that wolves had intelligence far surpassing what most people assumed. Agnes missed him every day, especially on winter mornings when the mountains felt too big and too quiet. She opened the notebook. Inside were sketches of wolves, detailed drawings Benjamin had made during his observations. One sketch stood out: a mother wolf pushing a lost fawn gently toward the tree line. Benjamin had written beneath it, "Frost pine wolves protect young creatures not their own. A strange phenomenon, worth study." Agnes traced the words with trembling fingers. The frost pine pack had a reputation, a myth almost, for stepping between young animals and danger. No one believed it except Benjamin. Now Agnes wondered if history was repeating itself. Could the wolves be looking for something? Someone? Her thoughts turned to Jacob, the quiet man with tired eyes and a scar brushing the edge of his jawline. Strong, weathered, and unreachable, but gentle in a way that reminded her of Benjamin. If Jacob found an injured dog, then maybe... The phone jolted her from her thoughts. Agnes lifted the receiver. A tiny voice on the other end, Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly widow with thin white hair and trembling hands, reported that the supply shed behind her house had been broken into. Footprints everywhere. Strange noises at night. Agnes promised she'd check in later, but her mind was already stitching threads together. Missing dog, traps near the river, wolves behaving strangely, Jacob wandering the ridge. Something dangerous was unfolding. Back in the forest, Jacob continued deeper, shadow following. Eventually, he reached a clearing. Not far ahead, the remains of a temporary hunting camp lay half hidden beneath the snow. A fire pit, tin cans, boot prints everywhere, and something else. A piece of black fabric dangling from a branch. Jacob approached, touching it. Synthetic. Camouflage. Not military grade. Cheap. Store-bought. Probably used to obscure the camp from rangers. Shadow growled low in his throat. Jacob straightened. Someone used this place recently. He scanned the ground again. Tracks led away, back toward his cabin. His muscles tensed. Someone had been near his home long before the wolves arrived. He began the trek back, Shadow limping but determined. Halfway to the cabin, Shadow stopped. Jacob followed the pup's gaze and froze. The frostpine wolves stood across the clearing, precisely where he had left them hours earlier. All six, silent, motionless, watching him with eyes that betrayed neither hostility nor fear, just recognition. Jacob breathed slowly, trying to understand. They made no move as he approached. Shadow whimpered softly, lowering his head. The leader wolf stepped forward one pace. Jacob stiffened, but the wolf simply looked at Shadow, then back at Jacob, then stepped back to its pack. No threat, no aggression, only acknowledgement. Jacob stood there, heart pounding, as realization settled over him. The wolves were not enemies. For reasons he didn't yet understand, they were waiting. Jacob Hartman stood at the threshold of his cabin, one hand resting on the frame, the other gently gripping Shadow's collar to steady the young German shepherd on his injured leg. Outside, the world was a quiet palette of winter blue, snow covering every branch, every stone, every trace of the previous night, except for the unmistakable shapes moving across the ridge. The frostpine wolves remained where he had last seen them, a silent formation across the clearing, watching him with eerie patience. Shadow whimpered, his ears twitching as he recognized them. Jacob's breath condensed into a thin cloud in front of him as he stepped forward. The wolves didn't react aggressively. They didn't growl or retreat. Instead, the pack leader, A massive wolf with slate-gray fur and amber eyes burning like coals beneath a mantle of frost stepped out of formation and approached at a slow, deliberate pace. Jacob tensed, but didn't move. His instincts whispered caution, but something deeper held him still. The leader's paws pressed softly into the snow, making almost no sound as he came closer. Shadow limped forward, tail tucked, but not from fear, something closer to recognition. The leader wolf stopped a few feet away and lowered his head in a slow, measured bow. Jacob felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Wolves didn't bow. Not to humans, not to dogs. This was something else, something that felt ancient, almost ritualistic. Shadow responded with a trembling step forward, lifting his muzzle toward the great wolf. Jacob realized the meaning suddenly and with startling clarity. Shadow wasn't merely a stray who had wandered near the pack. He had been accepted, at least for a time, into their fold. A pack-adopted pup, Jacob murmured, a phenomenon he once read about but never actually witnessed. Wolves were known to take in abandoned young animals, fawns, fox kits, under bizarre and rare circumstances. But for them to accept a domestic dog, that was nearly unheard of. The leader wolf took another step forward, and Jacob's muscles clenched. But the wolf merely nudged Shadow's forehead with his nose, a gesture tender but firm, like the acknowledgement of kin. Shadow whined softly, pressing into the wolf's thick fur. Jacob couldn't look away. The moment held a strange gravity, one that bridged the wild and the human worlds in a way he had never imagined. He whispered, "They tried to save you, didn't they?" The wolf lifted his head, meeting Jacob's gaze. Those amber eyes held a steadiness that made Jacob swallow. The message, though mute, felt unmistakable. "We are not your enemy. We are part of his story." Jacob slowly lowered himself to one knee beside Shadow. His breath shook slightly, though not from the cold. Something in him, something that had been dented and rusted by grief and guilt, felt like it was unlocking. The moment broke when the wind carried a soft crunch of snow behind him. Jacob turned. Agnes Porter approached the cabin, bundled in a thick brown coat with a wool scarf tightly wrapped around her neck. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, and her gray curls peeked from beneath a knitted hat. She carried a small basket covered with cloth, steam faintly rising from inside. "Jacob!" she called softly but urgently. "I brought you food, and some broth for the dog." Jacob nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Agnes. He could use it." As she stepped closer, Agnes froze mid-stride when she saw the wolves gathered near the cabin. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with astonishment that softened into something almost nostalgic. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. "Benjamin was right." Jacob frowned slightly. "About what?" Agnes took slow, steady steps forward. She wasn't afraid. If anything, she looked moved, her eyes shimmering with remembrance. Her late husband, Benjamin Porter, had been a tall, solemn man with steady gray eyes and a gentle spirit, qualities Agnes often mentioned when she spoke of him. He had believed the Frostpine Pack possessed unusual intelligence and empathy, something deeper than instinct. Agnes pointed to the leader. "That one. Years ago, long before you came here, Benjamin got caught in a sudden blizzard, thought he wouldn't make it home. But that wolf found him, circled him, nudged him toward a sheltered ridge, led him out of the storm." She paused, swallowing. No one believed him, but he swore that wolf saved his life. Jacob looked back at the pack, trying to reconcile the stories of wild predators with the silent beings standing before him. "They knew Shadow," he said. Agnes nodded. "And I think Shadow knew them. Poor thing probably survived because of them." Her voice softened. "These wolves, they understand more than most folks give them credit for." Shadow moved again, pressing his head deeper into the leader wolf's fur, an affectionate gesture that melted Jacob's heart more than he expected. The leader accepted the gesture, then stepped back, nudging Shadow gently, as if encouraging him to return to Jacob. Shadow obeyed, limping back toward Jacob's leg. Jacob rested a hand on the pup's head as the leader wolf released a soft exhale, almost like a sigh. The other wolves began to shift, their movements fluid and quiet. Snow fell gently over them, clinging to their thick coats. One by one, they turned and began walking back toward the forest. But the leader stayed a moment longer. Jacob met his gaze. For a heartbeat, no wind blew, no branch creaked. The wolf's amber eyes held an expression Jacob could only interpret as acknowledgement or gratitude. Then the wolf turned, trotting gracefully after the others. Shadow watched them leave, ears tilted forward, tail lowering in calm resignation. He took one tentative step forward, and Jacob led him. Shadow pressed his head against the leader wolf's retreating fur in a final, soft farewell. When the wolf disappeared between the pines, Shadow returned to Jacob, leaning against his leg. Jacob exhaled slowly, moved by a connection he didn't fully understand, but deeply respected. The wild had not taken Shadow back. It had returned him. Night fell over Frostpine Range with a bitterness that seemed to seep straight into the bones of the mountains. Heavy snow clouds gathered like bruises across the sky, smothering the moon and swallowing the forest in a suffocating darkness. Wind rattled the pines, sending loose powder swirling in ghost-like spirals. It was the kind of night where even the bravest animals sheltered in silence, and the kind of night when dangerous men took advantage of the world's blindness. Inside the cabin, Jacob Hartman paced slowly before the fireplace, trying to quiet the unease building in his chest. Shadow lay beside him on a thick blanket, his hind leg gently stretched out after hours of rest. The young German shepherd was recovering well, though pain still flickered across his features when he shifted wrong. His coat, though still patchy from the river and the injury, had begun to regain some of its softness, and his eyes, warm, earthy, loyal, followed Jacob wherever he moved. "You're getting stronger," Jacob murmured, crouching to rub the side of Shadow's neck. Shadow leaned into the touch, tail sweeping gently along the wooden floor. But both man and dog stiffened at the same time when a sudden crack echoed outside. A branch breaking. Too close. Jacob froze. His training kicked in instantly. His senses sharpened, heart steadying instead of racing. Something, or someone, was out there, and not a wolf. Their movements were swift and deliberate. This was heavier, human. He reached for the flashlight and the heavy walking stick he kept near the door. A firearm rested in a locked case across the room, but Jacob preferred to avoid escalating any situation unless absolutely necessary. He didn't want to kill anyone. Not anymore. Shadow stood, balancing carefully on 3 legs, ears pricked and body tense. Jacob whispered, "Stay close." Outside, the storm intensified, the wind howling around the cabin like something wounded. Snow whipped across the clearing, making visibility nearly impossible. Jacob tightened his grip on the flashlight, then slowly opened the cabin door. The cold slapped him in the face, but something else hit harder A figure standing in the snow, only a few yards away. The man was tall and wiry, with broad shoulders hunched beneath a ragged camo jacket. His beard was uneven, patchy, framing a face that looked harsh and drawn, eyes flickering with frantic intensity. His black hair stuck out from beneath a frost-covered beanie. In one hand, he held a rope. In the other, a long metal tool used for handling animal traps. Jacob recognized the type instantly. A hunter who had crossed a line so long ago he no longer saw it. A poacher, a trapper. The man stepped forward. "That's my dog," he snarled, voice raw from cold and anger. "Hand him over." Jacob's stance hardened, though his voice remained even. "Shadow isn't yours." "Oh, he's mine," the man spit back. "Stupid mutt escaped before I sold him off. Cost me money. And now with the sheriff sniffing around, he'll get me locked up unless I tie off loose ends." Jacob's jaw tightened. "You're hurting animals, setting illegal traps. That ends tonight." The trapper's expression twisted into a hateful sneer. "A big war hero thinks he can tell me what to do?" He stepped closer, face illuminated by Jacob's flashlight. His features were sharp, too sharp, and his eyes carried that unhinged edge Jacob had seen in men who had been broken by their own choices, men who lashed out at the world instead of fixing themselves. "I'm only going to say it once," the man growled. "Give me the dog." His hand tightened around the trap tool like a weapon. Shadow growled, a low, warning sound Jacob had not heard from him before. The pup stepped in front of Jacob despite his injury. "No," Jacob said quietly. The trapper lunged. Jacob dodged the first swing, the metal arm of the trapper's tool slicing through the air. Shadow barked sharply, circling to flank the attacker. Snow churned under Jacob's boots as he blocked the next strike with his walking stick, the impact vibrating up his arm. Then, another sound. Not wind, not snow. A ripple in the dark. Dozens of paws moving across frozen ground. The trapper swung again, screaming, "I'll kill you! I'll kill the mutt!" He didn't finish. From behind the tree line, shadows emerged. Large, fluid, silent. Wolves. 6 of them. Their bodies moved with precision, forged through generations of survival, their fur bristling as they formed a perimeter around Jacob and Shadow. The pack's leader stepped forward, amber eyes blazing with primal authority, the trapper's face drained of color. "No, no, stay back." But the wolves did not attack. They surrounded him, every angle blocked, tightening the formation the way a hunting pack drove an elk away from its herd. The trapper stumbled backward, his breath turning to frantic gasps, slipping on the snow. Jacob stood still, keeping Shadow close, letting the wolves take control of the moment. Then a beam of light cut through the chaos. "Jacob!" Agnes Porter appeared between the trees, holding a flashlight in one hand and a heavy coat wrapped around her other arm. Her boots sank deep into the snow as she hurried forward, eyes wide behind her fogged-up glasses. Her gray curls escaped her knitted hat as she approached the scene. "What on earth?" she gasped, stopping when she saw the wolves in formation. Then she saw Jacob and Shadow in the center, and the trapper surrounded. Agnes's breath trembled. "Dear Lord." Jacob shook his head slightly. "Stay back, Agnes." But Agnes, despite her age, held a strong, steady presence. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She understood the balance of nature better than most. The trapper tried to bolt. Bad mistake. He spun away from the wolves and sprinted blindly through the snow, panic twisting his movements. Jacob shouted a warning, "Don't go that way!" Too late. A sharp crack, snow giving way, and the trapper vanished into the earth with a strangled cry. He had fallen straight into one of his own traps, a hidden pit lined with sharpened stakes set for wolves. Agnes gasped. Jacob exhaled, steady and grim. The wolves stood at the rim of the pit, staring down at their former tormentor, but did nothing else. They simply watched, their judgment already complete. Sheriff Mallory and 2 deputies arrived minutes later, summoned by Agnes's earlier warnings. Sheriff Mallory was a thick-built man in his 50s, with a bushy gray mustache and a temperament somewhere between weary and impatient. His face softened, though, when he saw Jacob and the dog. "Looks like justice took care of itself tonight," Mallory muttered, ordering his deputies to pull the trapper out. Jacob looked toward the wolves. They had already begun to fade into the tree line, their formation dispersing as silently as it had formed. Wild guardians returning to the dark. Shadow watched them go, tail lifted slightly. Jacob knelt beside the pup, gently scratching behind his ear. "You're safe now," he whispered. Night closed in again, quieter this time, the storm easing. The danger was gone. The trapper was caught. And in the snow-covered clearing, a strange circle of protection remained imprinted. Man, dog, wolves, each guarding the other in a moment of unspoken unity. Morning unfurled gently over Frostpine Range, casting soft ribbons of pale gold across the snow-covered valley. After the violent storm and the confrontation with the trapper, the mountains seemed to exhale, releasing tension that had settled in every tree, every ridge, every drifting shadow. Frost clung to the pine branches like delicate lace, shimmering in the sunlight, and smoke rose from Jacob Hartman's cabin chimney in a thin, comforting curl. Inside, warmth filled the small wooden structure. The fire crackled softly while Shadow slept near it, curled into a tight ball with one paw tucked beneath his chin. The young German shepherd had made remarkable progress, his legs still stiff, his movements still occasionally uneven, but his energy, his natural spark, had returned. His fur looked healthier after days of warmth and care, and his ears now perked at the slightest sound. Jacob watched him from the kitchen table where he sat, nursing a cup of hot coffee. His face, usually defined by the hard lines of a soldier who'd carried too much weight for too long, softened as he looked at the dog. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging. Shadow had carved his way into Jacob's life like a small flame in a cold wilderness, a flame Jacob didn't realize he had needed. He reached down and stroked Shadow's head when the pup wandered over, tail swaying. "You're getting there," Jacob said with a faint smile. "Soon, you'll be running circles around me." Shadow pawed his leg, insisting on attention. Jacob chuckled, a sound rare and foreign to him. It startled him how natural it felt. He reached for the leash he'd fashioned from spare rope, and Shadow wagged harder. "Okay, buddy, training time." Outside, the snow was crisp, the air fresh with pine and cold sunlight. Jacob led Shadow a short distance from the cabin, choosing a patch of flat snow where they could work. He crouched, showing Shadow basic commands. Sit, stay, come. Despite the pup's injury, he responded eagerly. Too eagerly at times, his enthusiasm forcing him into wobbly pivots and awkward steps that made Jacob laugh under his breath. "Slow down," Jacob said, guiding him gently. "One step at a time." Shadow cocked his head, the way dogs do when trying to understand the world. There was intelligence in his eyes, a sharpness that hinted at time spent surviving in the wild, perhaps even learning the unspoken language of wolves. Between exercises, Jacob would pause, observing Shadow's movements carefully to ensure he wasn't pushing too hard. When Shadow tired, Jacob knelt and rubbed his shoulders, feeling the pup lean into him with full trust. "You saved me too," Jacob whispered, almost surprised by his own voice. He didn't mean physically. He meant the quiet companionship, the chance to care for something vulnerable without fear of losing it to gunfire or chaos. Shadow gave him purpose, a grounding force that helped silence the guilt he carried from the past. Later that afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. Shadow barked softly, alert, but not afraid. Jacob opened the door to find Agnes Porter, bundled in her wool coat and knitted scarf, holding a large pot covered with a towel to keep the steam in. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and a small smile brightened her lined face. "Thought you could use something warm today," she said. "Chicken and barley soup." Jacob stepped aside and welcomed her in. "Thank you, Agnes. Shadow will be thrilled too." "Oh, I brought some for him as well." She smiled down at the pup, who wagged his tail enthusiastically. "He deserves it after everything he's survived." Agnes settled into a chair, while Jacob ladled soup into 2 bowls. The aroma, rich broth, herbs, and vegetables, filled the cabin instantly. Agnes cupped her bowl in both hands, letting the warmth seep through her gloves. "I was thinking," she said after a moment, "how much this reminds me of Benjamin's recovery after the blizzard." Her smile thinned slightly, touched with memory. He came home with frostbite and a strange story about wolves leading him through the snow. No one believed him, except me. Jacob listened closely. Agnes rarely spoke about her late husband in such detail. "He was a good man," she continued, brushing a strand of gray hair from her forehead. "Quiet, like you. But he carried things inside. Hard things. The kind you only understand if you've seen too much." Jacob lowered his gaze, understanding more deeply than words needed. Agnes reached out and patted his hand. "Jacob, you and Shadow." She paused, smiling. "You two remind me of a new beginning. Something this mountain hasn't seen in a long time." He didn't respond right away. Emotions, real ones, took time to settle in him now. But the cabin felt fuller with Agnes here, warmer, as if the 3 of them formed a tiny community carved out of frost and hardship. "Thank you," he finally said, voice quiet but sincere. As the afternoon light dimmed, Agnes told stories of the early days in Pine Grove, of her first rescue animals, of Benjamin's stubborn devotion to the frost pine wolves, of winters so harsh they seemed to crack even the strongest spirits. She spoke with the wisdom of age, her voice soft, soothing, a steady river reminding Jacob that healing didn't have to be a solitary path. Jacob found himself sharing too, small pieces at first, then more. He spoke of Reyes, his teammate lost overseas, of the guilt that had driven him into isolation, of the nightmares that clung to him even now. Agnes listened without judgment, her eyes gentle. "Sometimes," she said, "we think we're broken, when really we are just waiting for the right reason to stand again." Shadow pressed against Jacob's leg, as if agreeing. When Agnes left shortly before dusk, the world had turned lavender blue. Jacob stood outside the cabin, watching her walk down the snowy path toward town, with her flashlight swinging in a slow rhythm. He felt lighter, steadier, as though some weight he had carried far too long had finally loosened. The wilderness grew quiet again, until Shadow lifted his head and stared toward the ridge. Jacob followed his gaze. Up on the hill, Against the backdrop of fading twilight stood the frostpine wolves. The entire pack. Their silhouettes were dark and graceful atop the snow, tails still, heads high. They watched the cabin with calm, steady intention. The leader wolf stood at the center, ears pricked forward, his amber eyes glowing faintly even from the distance. Their presence wasn't ominous. It felt protective, as if they were standing guard over Jacob and Shadow, offering acceptance from a world beyond human understanding. Shadow stepped closer to Jacob, his body relaxed. Jacob breathed in the cold air, sensing something profound in the moment. A silent blessing, a recognition of a bond formed not by blood, but by trust. A new family, born of survival and compassion, watched over the cabin from Frostpine Ridge. And Jacob felt, for the first time in years, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Spring arrived in Frostpine Range, not with the sudden burst of warmth that happened in softer lands, but with a subtle shift, a loosening of winter's grip, a gentle sigh from the mountains as icicles thinned and pine branches shook away their jackets of frost. The river that once nearly stole Shadow's life now murmured softly, carrying chunks of melting ice downstream like offerings to the changing season. Jacob Hartman stood on the porch of his cabin, a mug of black coffee steaming between his hands. The air still held winter's crisp bite, but the sunlight was richer now, edging toward gold instead of cold blue. He breathed deeply, feeling something bloom quietly in his chest. Peace, true peace, something he had once convinced himself he had lost the right to feel. Shadow lay at his feet, sprawled in a patch of early morning light. The young German shepherd had grown stronger each week, his coat now thick and glossy, except for a faint scar on his hind leg, a reminder of what he'd endured and overcome. His ears perked at every bird call drifting through the trees, but instead of the anxious tension he once held, his posture radiated calm confidence. Jacob nudged him gently with a boot. "Come on, partner. Time to check in with Agnes." Shadow barked softly, tail thumping against the porch. He stood, stretched in an exaggerated curve, then trotted beside Jacob as they walked down the newly thawed trail into Pine Grove. Agnes Porter waited outside her rescue center, sweeping the wooden steps with a briskness that belied her 71 years. She was small and slightly rounded from age, but she carried herself with purposeful energy. Her short, gray curls framed a face lined with years of compassion and quiet resilience. Today, she wore a faded blue flannel shirt under a thick vest and sturdy boots that had seen decades of mountain winters. Shadow ran up to her, tail spinning, and Agnes laughed, a soft, musical sound. "There's my boy," she said, scratching behind his ears. "Jacob, he's looking better every day." Jacob smiled slightly. "He's a fighter, just like his owner," Agnes replied, giving him a knowing look. Jacob cleared his throat, slightly embarrassed. "I'm not his owner, not officially." "Then make it official," she said simply, turning to unlock the door. "Sometimes family isn't chosen by law. Sometimes it's chosen by love." Inside the rescue center, sunlight streamed through dusty windows, casting warm light over kennels, animal beds, and shelves stocked with medical supplies. The scent of hay, disinfectant, and soft fur filled the air. A ginger cat named Poppy, round-faced, elderly, and always slightly offended at newcomers, glared at Shadow from her perch. Shadow gave her a respectful, wide berth. Jacob began his morning tasks with practiced ease, cleaning, refilling food bowls, repairing a broken latch. Shadow followed him faithfully, occasionally nudging Jacob's leg as if checking in. Agnes watched them both from her wooden desk, her heart swelling. She had always believed people and animals found each other for reasons. Even her husband Benjamin used to say, "Compassion isn't something you give, it's something you live." Seeing Jacob laugh softly as Shadow bumped his arm made her believe life had finally begun giving back. "Jacob," she said, clearing her throat as she sifted through a stack of envelopes. "I received a letter this morning." He glanced over. "Good news?" Agnes held the letter carefully, as if it were something fragile and precious. "From my son, Daniel." Jacob remembered the bit of story she'd shared. Daniel, tall and polite, but distant, a man who carried his grief poorly after Benjamin passed. He'd left Pine Grove abruptly years ago and never quite found the courage to return. "What did he say?" Jacob asked. "That he's coming home," Agnes breathed. Tears welled in her eyes. "He wants to visit, to talk, to reconnect." She smiled, trembling. I think you were right, Jacob. Winter doesn't last forever." Jacob felt a gentle warmth spread through him. "He'll be happy to see you, and this place, and to meet you," she added. "I've told him about the man who brought the mountains back to life." Jacob shook his head, embarrassed. "You give me too much credit." "No," Agnes said softly. "You give yourself too little." Shadow barked once, as if in agreement. As the weeks passed, Frostpine Range continued to transform. Snow receded from the trails, revealing mossy earth and scattered pine cones. Water dripped steadily from rocky ledges. Sunlight lingered longer each day. Jacob found himself growing into a new rhythm, something gentler than his years of service had ever allowed him. He repaired fences at the rescue center, helped Agnes update the old building, and took Shadow on longer walks to build strength in the dog's healing leg. He woke each morning with a sense of purpose that felt clean, uncomplicated. Shadow's reputation spread quickly through Pine Grove. Locals called him the Little Valley Guardian, claiming he had the spirit of a wolf despite being a domestic dog. Children adored him. Elderly couples gifted him treats. Even Sheriff Mallory, rough and skeptical, always greeted him with a gruff, "Good boy," whenever they crossed paths. Shadow seemed to understand the responsibility placed on him. His posture had changed, more confident, more sure of his place in this world. He watched the woods with respectful awareness, and when he barked, it was rarely without reason. Jacob often caught him staring toward the ridge where the frostpine wolves roamed, as if waiting for something, as if listening to something only he could hear. One early spring morning, Jacob took Shadow to the riverbend, the place where everything had begun. Mist curled gently off the melting water, turning the landscape into a pale, haunting dream. Shadow sniffed the air, ears pricked. Jacob followed his gaze toward the ridge. There, outlined against the horizon, stood the frostpine wolves, the entire pack. Their fur glowed silver under the rising sun. Their formation was calm, neither hunting nor cautious, simply present, watching. Jacob felt a familiar pull in his chest, a sense that something meaningful was about to unfold. The leader wolf stepped forward from the pack, his movements graceful and sure. He descended the ridge in long, powerful strides, stopping only a few feet away. Shadow trotted toward him, tail wagging low and slow in a respectful greeting. Jacob knelt, watching. The leader wolf lowered his head, an unmistakable gesture of recognition. A farewell. Jacob reached down and lifted Shadow gently onto his shoulders, the way he had carried him out of the freezing river. Shadow balanced comfortably, one paw resting on Jacob's shoulder. The leader wolf stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance behind Jacob, and the pack followed, silent, noble, protective without threat. In that moment, two worlds met without conflict, the wild and the human, bound by trust, gratitude, and something older than language. Shadow barked softly. Jacob smiled. Between them all, man, dog, wolves. An unspoken promise lingered in the warming air. This valley protects its own, and always will. In the end, the story of Jacob, Shadow, and the Frostpine Wolves is more than a tale about survival in the mountains. It is a quiet reminder that even in the hardest winters of our lives, grace can find us in unexpected forms. Sometimes, God's miracles arrive not in thunder or revelation, but in small companions carried from the river, in kindness offered by strangers, and in the peace that comes when a wounded heart finally learns to trust again. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on the blessings around you, the people who walk beside you, the animals who remind us of unconditional loyalty, and the quiet protections we receive every day without ever seeing the hand behind them. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe that God still works through the gentle, the humble, and the unexpected, consider subscribing to the channel so these messages of faith and compassion can reach more hearts. May God watch over you, your family, and every creature He places in your path.